This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. The Johnson family had prepared for Ruby's arrival for weeks, transforming their home into a space meant to welcome, to nurture, to heal. Ruby was 15, nearly grown, with a thin, slight frame and eyes that held too much for someone her age. She had been in and out of foster homes since early childhood, moving through a succession of families who had either failed her or whom she had failed to fit with. The Johnsons hoped they could be different, that their love and patience would provide a foundation she could trust. In their minds, Ruby was a girl who needed structure, kindness, and a chance at stability. But as they would come to understand, there was a darkness within Ruby, something that clung to her like a shadow she could never quite shake. From the moment she entered the Johnson home, there was a stillness about Ruby, a kind of careful quiet that settled into the air around her. Lila and Michael Johnson noticed her reserved nature immediately, a subtle wariness that seemed to color her every movement. She was polite, quiet, and almost unnervingly composed. She never caused a fuss, never raised her voice, yet something about her presence felt unnatural, as though she were a guest who didn't intend to stay. The Johnsons chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of her surroundings, but even Malik and Ava, their own two young children, seemed to sense something unusual about her. They watched her with a mix of awe and discomfort, uncertain how to bridge the gap between themselves and this girl who had entered their lives so abruptly. In the beginning, the family tried to bring Ruby into their fold. They spent their evenings together, hoping she would join their laughter and become a part of their small traditions. But Ruby's participation was always passive. She seemed to observe rather than belong, her eyes watchful and her smile faint, almost as if mimicking the warmth she couldn't feel. Lila, a woman with a deep maternal instinct, felt a pang of sadness each time she saw Ruby drift to the periphery of the room, as though keeping a deliberate distance. She tried to give Ruby the space she seemed to need, but she couldn't ignore the unease that began to grow within her. Ruby was like a shadow in their home, silent, always there, but never quite a part of them. The first strange occurrence was small, barely worth noting: a family photograph that fell from the mantel and shattered in the night. Lila found the broken frame on the floor the next morning, glass scattered across the hardwood floor. She swept up the pieces and assumed it was an accident, perhaps a gust of wind or an unnoticed tremor from outside. But as the days passed, other incidents followed, small but unsettling. Malik and Ava began to complain of their toys going missing, only to reappear in odd places, like the basement or tucked under Ruby's bed. A set of car keys vanished from the kitchen counter, and Lila found them days later, buried in a drawer that no one in the family ever used. The family dismissed these occurrences at first, chalking them up to forgetfulness or coincidence. But with each new incident, a sense of unease began to grow, creeping into the edges of their lives like a shadow that stretched with every passing day. Then came the strange noises. It started with soft thumps in the night, faint sounds that drifted through the walls like whispers. The Johnsons were no strangers to the creaks and groans of an older house, but these noises were different, subtle yet deliberate, like the footsteps of someone moving carefully through the darkness. Michael would get up to check, moving from room to room in the quiet hours of the night, but he never found anything out of place. Ruby's room was always silent, her door closed, her presence undisturbed. Yet the sounds persisted, each one heightening the tension that was slowly winding through the house, filling every corner with a quiet dread. Lila's unease deepened as she noticed other small changes, details that were easy to miss individually, but, together, painted a picture that troubled her. She would find Ruby standing at odd hours in the hallway, her face partially hidden in shadow, watching without expression as her adoptive siblings played or her parents prepared dinner. Her eyes followed them, steady and unblinking, with an intensity that made Lila's skin prickle. She began to feel as though Ruby were studying them, observing each detail of their lives as though cataloging them for reasons she couldn't comprehend. Lila's heart ached with the desire to reach out to her, to bridge the chasm of silence that Ruby seemed to place between herself and everyone around her. But each time she tried, Ruby withdrew, slipping away with a quiet finality that left Lila feeling helpless, her maternal instincts frustrated by the invisible wall Ruby had erected around herself. As days passed, Michael began to feel the tension too, though he tried to dismiss it. He reassured Lila that Ruby just needed time, that her distance was a defense mechanism honed over years of abandonment and instability. But even he couldn't deny the peculiar atmosphere that had settled over the house. There was a chill in the air, an intangible darkness that seemed to cling to the walls, settling into their home in a way that no warmth could dispel. Malik and Ava grew more subdued, their playful laughter fading, as they too sensed the tension that had taken root. They avoided Ruby's room, steering clear of her presence with the instinctive wariness of children who sense a threat they cannot name. The turning point came one night when Lila woke to find the lights flickering throughout the house. She went downstairs, her footsteps quiet as she moved through the darkened hallways, and felt a sudden coldness that made her pause. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of unease that made her chest tighten. In the dim light, she caught a glimpse of Ruby standing at the end of the hallway, her face illuminated by the faint, erratic glow of the flickering lights. For a brief moment their eyes met, and in Ruby's gaze, Lila saw something that froze her to the core, a depth of darkness, a calmness that felt unnatural, as though Ruby were looking through her rather than at her. From that night on, Lila's worry became something darker, tinged with fear. She felt trapped in her own home, a place that should have been a sanctuary but now felt foreign and dangerous. She found herself watching Ruby with the same intensity Ruby had watched them, her mind turning over every detail, every small incident that had once seemed inconsequential. She began to wonder if Ruby's silence wasn't merely a product of trauma, but something else entirely, an intentional distance, a separation that Ruby maintained with a precision that bordered on eerie. The family grew more distant, each member silently aware of the strange presence that had entered their lives yet unwilling to confront it. Lila found herself lying awake at night, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't voice, her instincts screaming that something was wrong, terribly wrong. And in the quiet hours of the morning, as she watched the first light of dawn seep into the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that the Ruby they had brought into their home was not who she seemed, that beneath her calm exterior lay something cold and unfeeling. A presence that thrived in silence, lurking in the corners of their lives like a shadow waiting to envelop them all. The Johnson household had always been a place of warmth and laughter, a home filled with little signs of family life, framed drawings from the children, a well-worn sofa with the faint outlines of where they loved to sit, toys scattered and collected each night in a playful routine. But ever since Ruby's arrival, that warmth had taken on a brittle quality. It was as if the familiar spaces of their home were changing, warping under an unseen pressure, and the laughter that once filled the rooms had grown muted, tentative, as if stifled by an invisible weight pressing down on them. The first clear sign of this new reality emerged in the children, Malik and Ava. They had always been lively, full of energy and mischief, running through the house in games of tag or hiding, their voices ringing with excitement. But as the days with Ruby wore on, they grew quieter, their play more subdued. They began avoiding the basement and attic, spaces they'd once loved to explore. When Lila tried to ask why, they grew evasive, casting furtive glances at each other, their faces drawn with a worry far beyond their years. At night, Malik and Ava would often come to their parents' room, knocking quietly, asking to sleep with them. Lila and Michael, concerned yet hopeful that it was only a phase, made room in their bed, brushing aside the creeping feeling of something being terribly wrong. The house itself seemed to react to Ruby's presence. Small disturbances became part of their daily life. Lights flickered at odd hours, casting an eerie, stuttering glow over the rooms. The air conditioning, usually steady and reliable, would turn on and off seemingly at random, filling rooms with sudden drafts of cold air, even on the warmest nights. In the quiet moments, they would hear faint creaks, as if someone were moving through the house when no one else was awake. The doors that had been shut were found open, and objects left in one place appeared in another, as if rearranged by an unseen hand. One evening, Lila discovered something strange in the living room. Their wedding photo, which had always been on the mantel, was lying face down on the floor. When she picked it up, she saw that the glass was cracked, the break running like a jagged scar across the surface. It wasn't the first time an object had been found moved or broken, but this felt different, deliberate, almost as if meant to send a message. Lila's unease intensified, her heart racing as she glanced around the room, half expecting to find someone standing in the shadows, watching. She told herself it was just an accident, perhaps caused by one of the children playing. But deep down, a nagging thought took root: this wasn't an accident. Something, or someone, was letting them know that their lives were not as safe or as secure as they had believed. In the days that followed, Lila found herself growing more vigilant, keeping a close eye on Ruby, looking for any sign, any small gesture that might reveal her intentions. Ruby's behavior, however, remained unchanged: quiet, calm, watchful. She kept her distance from the family, her presence felt more as a shadow than as a person. It was as though she moved within their world without truly being a part of it, slipping through the cracks and blending into the background, an enigma that defied understanding. Lila felt her anxiety mounting, a tension that grew sharper with each passing day. Yet she couldn't bring herself to speak openly about it, not even to Michael, who was determined to believe in Ruby's innocence, convinced that she only needed time to adjust. Michael, too, began experiencing moments of unease, though he kept his thoughts to himself. One night, as he worked late in his home office, he felt a presence behind him, an eerie sensation of being watched. When he turned, he found nothing but empty space. He laughed it off, attributing it to fatigue, yet the feeling lingered, gnawing at him as he returned to his work. Later, he would swear he heard faint footsteps outside his office door, but when he stepped into the hallway, the house was silent, the rooms dark and still. The experience left him shaken, and though he refused to acknowledge it aloud, a seed of doubt had been planted. He began sleeping with one ear attuned to the quiet sounds of the house, alert to any small disturbance, his mind circling back to the question he was too afraid to ask: could Ruby be the cause? The tension reached a breaking point one morning when Lila awoke to find deep scratches on the dining room table, marks that hadn't been there the night before. The scratches formed strange, jagged patterns, lines that seemed almost intentional, as if someone had carved them deliberately. She ran her fingers over the grooves, cold dread pooling in her stomach. She didn't want to confront Ruby, but she felt she had no choice. When she asked the girl about it, however, Ruby's reaction was disturbingly calm. She neither admitted nor denied responsibility, simply staring back at Lila with a blank, impenetrable expression, her eyes dark and unreadable. Lila felt a chill run down her spine as Ruby's gaze held hers, a look that seemed far too steady, too composed for a girl her age. The encounter left her shaken, a feeling that stayed with her long after she had walked away. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the house became suffocating, as though a dark cloud had settled over their lives. Even the children sensed it, becoming more withdrawn, their laughter rare, their smiles hesitant. Malik and Ava seemed to grow more fearful with each passing day, their glances darting nervously around the house, as if they too sensed an invisible presence lurking in the shadows. They clung to their parents, refusing to sleep alone, whispering their fears in voices barely above a murmur, as if afraid that speaking too loudly would summon something from the darkness. Then came the nightmares. Both Lila and Michael began experiencing vivid, disturbing dreams, scenes of shadowy figures moving through their home, of whispered voices that seemed to echo through the halls. They would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, their hearts pounding, yet when they looked around, the house was quiet, the darkness undisturbed. But the feeling of dread remained, haunting them in those early hours, lingering long after they had woken. Each dream seemed to erode their sense of security, chipping away at the illusion of normalcy they had clung to. Even Michael, ever the skeptic, found himself questioning his convictions, wondering if perhaps Lila's suspicions weren't entirely unfounded. One night, the tension reached a climax. Lila had gone to check on Malik and Ava, only to find their room empty. Panic flooded her as she searched the house, her footsteps echoing through the darkened halls, her heart racing with fear. She finally found them huddled in a closet, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. They refused to speak, only clinging to her as if afraid to let go. She took them back to bed, staying with them until they fell asleep. But the image of their frightened faces lingered, a reminder of the fear that had taken hold of her family. In the silence that followed, Lila felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her, a certainty that they were no longer alone in their own home. It was as if some unseen force had invaded their lives, twisting the familiar into something sinister, filling every corner with an oppressive darkness that defied explanation. And as she lay awake, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that someone was waiting, lurking in the shadows, biding its time. In the days that followed, Michael and Lila spoke little of the events, each afraid to voice their fears, to give shape to the darkness that had settled over them. But the unspoken understanding was there, an acknowledgement that their lives had changed, that their home was no longer the safe haven it had once been. And in that silence, the tension grew, thickening with each passing day, until the air was heavy with the weight of secrets, with the knowledge that they were facing something far beyond their control, something that threatened to consume them all. The night had settled heavily over the Johnson home, blanketing it in a silence so deep that even the usual sounds of the neighborhood, distant traffic, the hum of passing insects seemed to have quieted, as if the world were holding its breath. Inside, the house was as still as it was dark, each room shrouded in shadow, the shapes of familiar furniture blurred by the dimness. Lila and Michael had gone to bed, their exhaustion mingled with the unease that had become an unspoken fixture of their lives. Sleep, when it came, was a fragile thing, fractured by the weight of worry, by dreams that hinted at darkness, by the relentless, invisible presence that seemed to hover around them. The children had been asleep for hours, or so they thought. Malik and Ava lay in their beds, tucked under the thick quilts that their mother had lovingly made for them, yet even they hadn't slept easily. The children had been whispering to each other before finally drifting off, exchanging words of comfort that were as much for themselves as they were for one another, holding on to each other's presence in the shared darkness. They had started to dread the nights, finding that sleep had grown elusive, replaced by a lingering fear that crept in with the falling shadows. In the hallway, a dim light from the night lamp spilled out, casting a soft glow along the narrow corridor outside their rooms. Its pale warmth was a small comfort, a familiar signal of safety and routine. But tonight that light seemed to waver, as if struggling to pierce the darkness pressing in around it. It cast long shadows that stretched out, flickering faintly as though warning of something just out of sight. It was near midnight when the first sound broke the silence, a muffled creak from somewhere deep in the house. In the quiet, it was as sharp as a crack, slicing through the stillness and setting off a chain reaction of tension that seemed to ripple through the air. Michael stirred in his bed, his senses half awake, his mind barely registering the noise as anything out of the ordinary. Houses had their sounds, it was something he'd told himself many times. The creaks, the soft moans of floorboards shifting, all normal. But tonight something felt different. This sound lingered, drawn out in an unnatural way, as though someone were moving slowly, carefully, as if trying not to be heard. A faint sense of dread tightened in his chest, and he listened, his body tense. Another sound followed, a soft thud from the hallway, as if something had brushed against the wall. He felt Lila stir beside him, her breathing changing as she too drifted toward wakefulness, sensing the disturbance even in her sleep. The quiet seemed to thicken, and for a long moment there was nothing. Only silence. Only the faint hum of blood in his ears, his heartbeat loud and uneven. Then, suddenly a piercing scream shattered the night, a sound so full of terror and shock that it pulled Michael and Lila from their bed in an instant. It was Ava's voice, high-pitched and raw with fear, reverberating through the walls with a force that made everything else feel frozen, suspended in a single moment of horror. They stumbled down the hallway, their feet stumbling over each other in their rush, driven by a primal instinct to reach her, to protect her from whatever had caused her to cry out. They reached the children's room, but what greeted them was a sight that turned their blood cold. The room was dark, the air thick with a metallic scent, sharp and unnatural. Ava was crouched in the corner, her small frame shaking, her face pale and wet with tears. Malik was nowhere in sight, his bed empty, the blankets pulled back as if he had left in haste or been taken. Before they could register the full scope of what was happening, a movement in the doorway caught their eye. It was Ruby, standing there in the shadows, her figure barely visible, an unsettling silhouette against the dim light from the hallway. She was still, almost statue-like, her head tilted slightly as if observing the scene with a calm detachment. In her hand was something dark and gleaming, a long object that glinted faintly in the light, a tool or weapon they couldn't quite identify. The sight of her there, unmoving, sent a jolt of terror through Lila's body, a primal fear that seized her heart and set her pulse racing. Lila felt her limbs turn to ice, a heavy paralysis sinking in as Ruby took a slow, deliberate step into the room, her eyes locked on them, unblinking and eerily calm. It was the calmness that terrified her most, the unnerving sense of control that emanated from the girl who had become a stranger in their home. She felt Michael's hand grip her arm, grounding her, but even his presence did little to quell the rising panic that surged within her. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, each second stretching out, unbearable. Then, as if on some silent cue, the house was filled with chaos. The lights flickered violently, casting the room in flashes of harsh brightness and plunging it back into darkness, each flash illuminating Ruby's face, the blankness of her expression, the dark glint in her eyes. Lila felt the air grow thick, choking, as if it were alive with an unseen force that pulsed around them, a malevolent presence that seemed to come from Ruby herself, emanating from her stillness, her silence. Desperate, Lila moved toward Ava, intent on reaching her daughter, but something held her back, a fear that if she moved too quickly, if she made a single wrong step, everything would shatter. The darkness around them seemed to grow, pressing in closer, as though it were drawn to Ruby, feeding off the strange calm that surrounded her. She felt as though they were trapped in a nightmare, a reality where fear and safety no longer existed, where only the cold certainty of danger remained. Michael, in a moment of desperation, lunged toward Ruby, hoping to grab whatever weapon she held, but she was quicker than he'd expected, her movements fluid and precise, as if she'd anticipated his every action. She sidestepped him with a grace that was almost unnatural, her gaze steady, fixed on him with a focus that sent a chill through his bones. It was as though she were playing a game, a deadly dance in which she controlled every step, every movement. The night seemed endless, the terror stretching out, each second filled with the pounding of their hearts, the cold sweat that clung to their skin. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and merging, turning the once familiar room into a place of menace and fear. The family's cries and gasps filled the house, a symphony of terror that reverberated through the empty rooms, each sound a testament to their desperation, their helplessness. And then, in a final haunting moment, Ruby stepped back into the shadows, her figure swallowed by the darkness, her presence dissolving into silence. The house was still once more, the echoes of their fear hanging in the air, the memory of her gaze imprinted on their minds. The terror remained, lingering like a stain, an indelible mark of the horror that had unfolded in the night, a reminder of the danger that had crept into their lives, turning their home into a place of nightmares. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows, casting a pale glow over the house, the Johnson family realized that nothing would ever be the same again. The horror of the night had left its mark, a scar that would forever change them, and they knew, in their hearts, that Ruby's presence had become something far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. Detective Carter Reeves stepped into the Johnson house the morning after the horror had unfolded, his gaze steely, his mind sharpened by years of unraveling the details of tragic, complicated cases. He'd seen his share of darkness, but this crime scene carried a weight that felt different, as though the house itself held onto an unseen, lingering presence. The silence within its walls felt heavy, every room charged with an energy that gnawed at him, urging him to dig deeper. The Johnson family's broken lives were starkly apparent: furniture overturned, objects strewn about in chaos, the telltale signs of a frantic struggle. The children's rooms, once carefully arranged and full of warmth, looked as though they'd been ravaged by some storm. But Ruby's room stood in stark contrast to the disarray. Her bed was perfectly made, her belongings meticulously organized, as if untouched by the violence that had torn through the house. Reeves couldn't shake the feeling that this incongruity was a clue, a piece of the mystery waiting to be uncovered. He began his investigation with the neighbors, who spoke of Ruby in hushed, uncertain tones. Most of them admitted they knew little about her. She had only recently been adopted by the Johnsons, and they hadn't seen much of her beyond an occasional passing glance. But the whispers hinted at something darker. Several of them recalled strange incidents that had unfolded since Ruby's arrival, moments that had unnerved them. A few neighbors mentioned that the Johnsons had once been a lively, close-knit family, but in recent months they had become quieter, withdrawn, almost as though they were hiding something or perhaps afraid. Reeves delved into Ruby's background, and it wasn't long before he discovered that her journey through the foster system was marked by a troubling pattern. She had been placed with multiple families over the years, each one offering her a home, stability, and a fresh start. Yet each placement had ended in tragedy, often cloaked in circumstances that defied simple explanation. Families that had taken her in had experienced sudden, unexplainable bouts of illness, accidents, and even mysterious disappearances. And in every case, Ruby had remained unharmed, a silent observer amid the chaos, slipping through the turmoil with a detachment that left Reeves deeply unsettled. He pored over the files, piecing together accounts from former foster parents and social workers who had handled Ruby's case. Some of the parents had described her as unnervingly quiet, too composed for her age, her demeanor almost eerie in its calmness. Others mentioned that she seemed to have an unsettling effect on those around her, as if she carried an invisible weight that seeped into the lives of her caretakers, changing the atmosphere of their homes. And in nearly every instance, her presence had preceded incidents that had irrevocably fractured each family. The more he uncovered, the stronger Reeves' sense of foreboding grew. He began to see a dark pattern woven through her past, an eerie consistency that painted her as more than just a troubled girl. There was a meticulousness to the incidents, as if they were orchestrated to unravel the lives of those who attempted to bring her into their homes. Though there was no direct evidence linking her to the tragedies, the accumulation of coincidences was too striking to ignore. He felt as though he were staring into a void, a darkness that couldn't be easily explained, as though the answers he sought lay beyond the realm of ordinary human behavior. As Reeves continued his investigation, he contacted several of Ruby's former foster families, hoping to find someone who could shed light on the strange occurrences that had followed her. The conversations were disturbing, each family recounting their own experiences with an unease that mirrored his own. They spoke of strange, inexplicable moments, objects moving on their own, family pets behaving erratically, bouts of tension and unease that had seeped into their lives until they could no longer ignore the impact Ruby had on them. And always the incidents had escalated slowly, beginning with small disturbances and building to moments of uncontainable fear. With each revelation, Reeves' conviction grew. He began to suspect that Ruby's presence held an influence far darker than her quiet demeanor suggested. She moved through people's lives like a shadow, an unseen force that sowed discord, unraveling the threads of stability and safety wherever she went. And with the Johnson family, it seemed the pattern had reached its horrifying crescendo. This wasn't a simple case of a troubled child, it was a chain of events that hinted at something far more sinister, a string of tragedies that marked her as the common thread. Reeves could feel the pieces falling into place. But he was haunted by the lack of tangible evidence. It was as though Ruby herself were an enigma that couldn't be contained by reason or proof. The horror of her history hung over him, a grim reminder of the lives she had touched and the family she had destroyed. He knew that if he didn't act, Ruby would continue her path, carrying her darkness to yet another unsuspecting home, leaving a trail of silent devastation in her wake. After days of unsettling discoveries, Detective Carter Reeves knew he had to take his investigation into a different realm, a place not bound by the straightforward logic of crime scene analysis or cold, factual evidence. The facts alone were not enough to explain Ruby's presence at the center of so much tragedy. Her history was marked by a haunting trail of broken families, but no clear, logical connection tied her to their unraveling. He decided to bring in Dr. Linda Morales, a respected psychologist specializing in trauma and juvenile psychopathy, hoping she might understand the forces at work within Ruby, and, perhaps, within the house where she now remained in temporary custody. Dr. Morales had experience with complex cases, especially with children who exhibited behaviors that defied typical diagnostic categories. Reeves watched as she sat across from Ruby in the quiet, sterile room at the station, her eyes keen, her demeanor calm but probing. Ruby's expression remained blank, a mask of serenity that made her look far older than her 15 years, as if she were watching Dr. Morales from someplace beyond her age, beyond reason. Her gaze was steady, almost unnervingly focused, and as the doctor began her assessment, it became clear that Ruby was not just a reluctant participant but an observer, as if it were she, not Dr. Morales, who was studying the dynamics of the room. As the sessions unfolded, Dr. Morales noted subtle details that set Ruby apart from other children with troubled pasts. Ruby exhibited a striking lack of emotional response. Her face rarely shifted from its placid expression, and her answers, though calm and articulate, were devoid of the typical human inflection that even the most reserved children naturally carried. Dr. Morales sensed that there was a layer beneath Ruby's placidity, a carefully guarded void, as though her lack of reaction were not a result of trauma, but of something else, something that insulated her from the world around her. Dr. Morales probed deeper, carefully steering the conversation toward Ruby's past placements, her experiences with the foster system, and her relationships with the families who had taken her in. But Ruby's responses remained unnervingly calm, her words detached, each answer a reflection of the same blank acceptance. She spoke of each family with the same lack of effect, describing events that were clearly traumatic illnesses, accidents, mysterious absences with a calm that made even Dr. Morales feel a chill run down her spine. It was as if Ruby saw herself as an outsider to her own life, merely a passenger observing a world she was never truly part of. In her private sessions with Detective Reeves, Dr. Morales shared her growing concern. She could find no trace of empathy in Ruby, no remorse, no hint of sorrow. Ruby did not speak of the family she'd lost with longing or regret, only as milestones, as facts to recount. Dr. Morales explained that while children with traumatic pasts often develop defense mechanisms to protect themselves, Ruby's responses did not align with those patterns. This was no mere dissociation, no shield built from the trauma of moving from home to home. It was, instead, a complete detachment from the concept of family, a separation so complete that she seemed almost incapable of attachment. During the final session, Dr. Morales attempted a different approach, testing Ruby's understanding of right and wrong, of connection, of human emotions that bound people together. She asked Ruby to describe her feelings about the Johnsons, to recall any moments where she had felt a sense of belonging or even happiness. But Ruby's words revealed nothing. Her descriptions were clinical, analytical, each memory recounted as though she were describing the layout of a room, rather than relationships with people who had welcomed her into their lives. She seemed oblivious to the fear she had caused, to the horror she had witnessed. Dr. Morales felt a dawning realization settle over her as she listened, each of Ruby's words confirming a pattern she had begun to suspect. Ruby's worldview was a vast emptiness, a psychological void where empathy and attachment should have been. It was as if her experiences with these families were experiments she observed from a distance, indifferent to the pain she caused. Ruby was not a victim of her circumstances but rather an enigma, one who moved through life without absorbing the feelings, the humanity, of those around her. She had adopted the language of emotions without the understanding, mimicking what she had learned from observing others, but without any internal resonance. As Dr. Morales reviewed her notes, she noted the traits that lined up with a rare condition and emotional coldness that bordered on psychopathy, yet it was different, more complex. Ruby possessed a level of awareness, a quiet intelligence that set her apart, an ability to observe and manipulate without malice or intent. She was, in many ways, like an actor who studied human behavior from the outside, meticulously collecting the details and nuances of emotions without feeling any of them herself. Dr. Morales struggled with this realization, a mixture of dread and fascination filling her as she understood the depths of Ruby's detachment. When Dr. Morales reported her findings to Detective Reeves, she explained her unsettling conclusion: Ruby was unlike any child she had encountered. Ruby's actions were not driven by anger or vengeance. There was no pattern of abusive behavior, no cries for help. Instead, she operated from a place devoid of warmth, of human connection. And perhaps this was the most dangerous element of all. Ruby acted with a purpose, an almost clinical curiosity that drove her to enter these families' lives, to watch as the threads of trust, love, and safety unraveled around her, all while remaining untouched by the devastation she left behind. Detective Reeves listened, his face drawn, his eyes fixed on Dr. Morales as her words sank in. He realized that the truth about Ruby would never fit within the bounds of a legal case, that her actions could not be easily defined as criminal or even intentional. She was an embodiment of a kind of darkness that operated without malice, a shadow that moved silently, observing, waiting. Reeves felt a chill spread through him, understanding that he wasn't facing a killer in the traditional sense, but rather a person whose presence alone fractured the lives of those she touched. The case had led him to a horrifying truth: Ruby was a force beyond empathy, beyond reason, a young girl whose very nature defied understanding. She was an anomaly, a human who lacked the core that connected most people to one another. And as Dr. Morales finished, her final words settled over him like a cold weight. Ruby was both aware and indifferent, an unfeeling presence that had, time and time again, left ruin in her wake. With no more answers than he'd started with, Reeves knew he was dealing with something far darker than he had ever encountered, a horror that was psychological, beyond the grasp of traditional justice. And as he stared through the window of the interrogation room, watching Ruby sit in quiet stillness, he felt the helplessness of facing an unsolvable mystery, one that might never yield a solution, one that would likely repeat itself, leaving its mark on others long after she was gone. As the investigation stretched into its final days, Detective Carter Reeves believed he had come to grips with the eerie nature of the case. The psychological profile Dr. Morales had painted of Ruby, the detached observer, the quiet catalyst of chaos, left him with a sense of closure, albeit a haunting one. He saw Ruby not as a typical criminal but as a living paradox, a figure of innocence whose presence alone could sow unimaginable devastation. Yet, just as he thought he'd unearthed the heart of the mystery, a final revelation upended everything. It began with a single call from a distant, nearly forgotten contact, a social worker from one of Ruby's early foster placements. She had seen Reeves's press release on the case and claimed she had more information, details that would complicate everything they thought they knew about Ruby. Reeves met her at a quiet diner outside of town, where she sat waiting, an air of unease about her as she clutched a thick, battered file. The social worker, a woman named Janice, appeared visibly troubled. She explained that Ruby's original files had always been thin, marred by vague references and missing information. But Janice had kept her own records on the girl, details that had never made it into the system. She had been Ruby's caseworker during the girl's early placements and had witnessed firsthand the bizarre, inexplicable events that seemed to follow Ruby wherever she went. At the time, she'd thought the strange happenings were merely coincidences or the result of Ruby's past trauma. But after hearing of the recent tragedy, Janice felt compelled to revisit those early days, to share what she knew. She handed the file to Reeves, who opened it to find notes that were startling in their specificity and unsettling in their content. Janice's records were littered with reports of strange, often unnerving incidents, foster parents who claimed that Ruby had an unsettling effect on their homes, that she brought with her an air of tension and discomfort that seemed to spread like a virus, slowly eroding the peace of the household. There were reports of accidents that had injured siblings, mysterious illnesses that had plagued each household, and accounts of children developing inexplicable fears after spending time with Ruby. The notes painted a picture not of overt violence or harm, but of an insidious, creeping darkness that seemed to envelop Ruby's surroundings, claiming each foster family as an unwitting victim. Yet the most disturbing detail was not in Janice's notes but in a small clipping she'd tucked within the file, a report from years prior, of a fire that had consumed the home of one of Ruby's first placements. The family had survived, but only barely, suffering injuries that left deep scars, both physical and emotional. The fire had been ruled an accident, a mishap with faulty wiring, but Janice's notes contained a chilling addition. Ruby had been found standing outside the burning house, her face expressionless, watching the flames with a calm that the firefighters had found unnerving. At the time, they'd chalked it up to shock, but in light of everything else, Reeves couldn't ignore the image: a young girl standing alone in the dark, watching a family's world burn. This revelation disturbed him to his core, but what Janice said next turned his unease into something darker. She mentioned that in her years working with Ruby, she'd encountered something disturbing: a series of drawings Ruby had made while under her supervision. The pictures, crudely rendered but hauntingly clear, depicted homes engulfed in shadows, rooms filled with screaming faces, figures that seemed trapped in silent agony. Most unsettling were the recurring symbols Ruby included, strange marks drawn over and over, as if she were tracing the same image in different contexts, leaving her dark signature across each page. Reeves flipped through the drawings Janice had kept, each image tugging at his sense of reality, deepening his horror with every page. He noticed a pattern in them: each home had a distinct layout, rooms sketched with surprising accuracy. As he looked closer, a sick realization took hold. The last drawing depicted a house eerily similar to the Johnsons' home, its rooms marked in the same pattern as theirs, each room darkened, each figure placed exactly where the Johnsons had been found on the night of the tragedy. Reeves's mind reeled. He couldn't deny the implications of what he was seeing. Somehow Ruby had envisioned or anticipated the night of horror at the Johnson home, committing it to paper long before the events had actually taken place. It was as if the drawing itself held an intent, a foreshadowing of what was to come, rendered with a disturbing precision that defied rational explanation. But how? The timeline didn't add up, nor did the idea of a child being capable of orchestrating such horror simply through drawings. Yet the evidence lay before him, and the clarity of Ruby's visions left him with no other conclusion. She had seen these events long before they happened, and possibly even caused them by the sheer, inexplicable weight of her presence. Determined to unravel this mystery, Reeves revisited Dr. Morales, sharing the details Janice had given him. Dr. Morales listened with a mix of horror and disbelief, visibly shaken by the implications of the drawings. She struggled to reconcile her professional understanding with what she now knew. This wasn't the typical psychopathy she had suspected, nor was it a matter of childhood trauma manifesting in dark, destructive behavior. Ruby's actions seemed almost supernatural, a power to draw people into her life only to watch them suffer, as if her very existence created cracks in the lives of those who drew close. Haunted and with little left to hold on to, Reeves made one last visit to the temporary custody facility where Ruby was being held. She sat there, silent as always, her face expressionless, her dark eyes following him as he entered the room. He felt a chill run through him, the sensation of being observed not by a child but by something beyond understanding, something that knew too much and revealed too little. As he sat down, she fixed him with that same unblinking stare, and for a moment he was struck by a horrifying thought. Ruby wasn't just a girl moving from family to family. She was more like a force, an entity that fed on chaos, her very presence unraveling the lives of those she encountered. In the silence he felt the weight of her gaze, and in her eyes he saw a glimmer of something: awareness, knowledge that she understood him far more than he could ever understand her. The darkness within her was not a symptom of her past, but a thing of its own, something that couldn't be tamed, couldn't be understood or controlled. And as he left the room, Detective Reeves knew with a chilling certainty that this was only the beginning, that Ruby would move on, leaving destruction in her wake, forever an enigma, a silent shadow that no one could contain. Reeves walked away, leaving Ruby behind, but her presence lingered, a weight that would follow him long after he left the building. In his heart, he knew that nothing would stop her, that this was a cycle that would repeat, leaving each new family to bear the scars of her darkness. And as he stepped into the night, he felt a hollow sense of helplessness, knowing that wherever Ruby went next, horror would follow, an unstoppable force leaving only silence, shadows, and the faint echo of a child's dark gaze.